Machiavelli, the architect of power. The following script is based upon the book titled The Prince, authored by Niccolò Machiavelli, and first published in the year 1513. Chapter 1. The Florentine Laboratory. Power is not bestowed by divine right, nor is it maintained by the fragile architecture of good intentions. History is a relentless slaughterhouse, and its mechanics are written exclusively in blood. To understand the true anatomy of a state, one must first examine the blood on the gears of history. Niccolò Machiavelli was born into the old Florentine nobility in the year 1469. He was not forged in a vacuum of theoretical philosophy, but in the crucible of a city torn by profound and violent contradictions. Florence was a living laboratory of power, divided relentlessly by two opposing currents of life. On one side stood the glittering, splendor-loving regime of Lorenzo de' Medici, Il Magnifico. Under Lorenzo, the youth consumed their time and money in idleness, gaming and excesses, believing that he who could wound others most cleverly was the wisest. On the other side loomed the shadow of the Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola, whose fervent and austere visions captivated the desperate masses. Yet Machiavelli observed these forces with a clinical, unsentimental eye, recognizing the fatal vulnerabilities inherent in both extremes. He saw Savonarola rise as a visionary leader, only to be destroyed when the multitude ceased to believe in his divine mandate. The friar was the ultimate unarmed prophet, a man who possessed no violent means to keep his followers steadfast or to compel the unbelievers. This was the first brutal lesson of statecraft. Faith without force is a guarantee of absolute ruin. The magnificent Medician rule collapsed entirely in 1494. Driven out by the shifting tides of Italian politics and the spectre of foreign invasion, this sudden downfall served as Machiavelli's immediate entry into the ruthless arena of public service. He was appointed Chancellor and Secretary to the Second Chancery, serving the 10 of liberty and peace. For 15 years, he served the Free Republic of Florence with unflinching vigilance. He did not spend these crucial years composing utopian fantasies in the quiet safety of a monastery. He spent them riding across an Italy fractured by perpetual war, reaping hard experience at the expense of others. He stood before the mighty and the treacherous, recording the real truth of the matter, rather than the imaginary republics of the past. His earliest diplomatic mission took him to Caterina Sforza, the formidable Lady of Forli. From her conduct and eventual fate, he extracted the austere truth that the goodwill of the people is a far stronger shield than the thickest fortress walls. But his most profound and systemic education in the failures of sovereignty came from observing the French crown. In the year 1500, Machiavelli was sent across the Alps to the court of King Louis XII. Louis had swept into Italy with overwhelming military force, occupying the Duchy of Milan with rapid ease. Yet the French king lost his prize just as quickly, driven out by his own catastrophic misunderstandings of how power must be anchored. Machiavelli watched the French monarch commit 5 capital errors, analyzing this failure like a surgeon dissecting a rotting cadaver. First, Louis willfully destroyed the minor powers of the region, the very allies who had thrown themselves into his lap for protection. Second, he increased the strength of an already formidable neighbor, aggrandizing the temporal power of Pope Alexander VI. Third, driven by the blind ambition to divide the Kingdom of Naples, he brought a massive foreign power, the King of Spain, into the heart of Italy. Fourth, the king failed to reside in the territory he had conquered, ignoring the basic rule that a prince must be present to stamp out disorders as they spring up. And fifth, he failed to establish colonies, choosing instead the ruinously expensive path of maintaining armed garrisons that only provoked the local populace. At Nantes, Machiavelli stood face to face with the powerful Cardinal of Rouen. When the Cardinal sneered that the Italians knew absolutely nothing of war, the Florentine Secretary delivered a cold, decisive retort. He replied that the French knew nothing of statecraft, for if they did, they would never have permitted the Church to attain such dangerous greatness. Machiavelli understood clearly what King Louis could not see. He recognized the iron law of politics. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful ensures his own inevitable ruin. Through his relentless service, Machiavelli realized that the fundamental nature of man remains tragically constant across the centuries. Italy had become a chaotic chessboard, overrun by Charles, robbed by Louis, ravaged by Ferdinand, and insulted by the Switzers. The Florentines themselves had rested their fragile hopes on hired condottieri, relying on the dangerous illusion of mixed soldiery. Machiavelli witnessed these mercenaries prove ambitious, without discipline, and fundamentally unfaithful, robbing their employers in peace and deserting them in war. He saw that men will constantly refuse to look at things as they really are, preferring to see them as they passionately wish them to be, and thus they are ruined. He recognized that time drives everything before it relentlessly, capable of bringing evil as well as good, and good as well as evil. He understood that in politics there are no perfectly safe courses, and that true prudence consists in choosing the least dangerous ones. He realized that the unpredictable, feminine force of Fortuna must be mastered through the raw, energetic virtue of a decisive leader. He concluded that a prince who relies entirely on fortune is lost the moment the wind changes direction. In 1512, the intricate machinery of the Florentine Republic finally broke under the immense weight of of these colliding European forces. The French were aggressively driven from Italy by the Holy League. The Spanish and Papal forces closed in, and the Medici returned to power. The Free Republic fell, and with it went Machiavelli's cherished office, his diplomatic status, and his personal freedom. He was dismissed by sudden decree, later accused of complicity in a desperate conspiracy, imprisoned and put to the question by brutal torture. Yet the analytical mind that had coldly observed the collapse of kings could not be broken by the agonizing tension of the strappado. Exiled to his small, dusty property at San Cassiano, he stripped off his mud-stained peasant clothes each evening. He donned his noble court dress and stepped into the ancient courts of the men of old, demanding the reasons for their historical actions. He distilled his rigorous 15 years of observation and danger into a pure, unforgiving science of governance. He recognized that the free city he had served so faithfully was merely one fragile manifestation of political authority. Having seen the machinery of the Republic break before his very eyes, we must now turn our gaze outward to the broader geometry of power. We must strip away the comforting illusions of how men ought to live and examine the grim reality of how they actually live. Having witnessed the ruin of his own city, we must now examine the different shapes a state can take. Chapter 2: The Geometry of States. All states and all powers that have held rule over men have been and are either republics or principalities. In this analytical anatomy of governance, we set aside the discussion of republics to focus exclusively on the mechanics of the principality. These structures are the cold instruments of sovereignty, acquired either by the prince's own prowess, the arms of others, or the volatile hands of fortune and ability. The geometry of power begins with a fundamental division: the hereditary state, long accustomed to the family of its prince, and the entirely new acquisition. New principalities may be completely autonomous, as Milan was to Francesco Sforza, or they may be members annexed to an existing hereditary dominion, like the Kingdom of Naples to the King of Spain. Within the hereditary state, the architecture of power is reinforced by the sheer duration of the ruler's family and the ancient ordinances of tradition. A prince of average ability maintains his position with minimal exertion, provided he does not transgress the established customs of his ancestors. He need only manage unforeseen accidents with moderate prudence to remain secure, for the weight of history serves as a natural barrier against innovation. Even if an extraordinary force should deprive him of his state, he will find the usurper's footing is precarious, and the throne is easily regained at the first sign of disaster. We find a historical archetype in the Duke of Ferrara, who withstood the fierce assaults of the Venetians, and Pope Julius, solely because his house was anciently established in his dominions. because the hereditary prince has less necessity to offend his subjects. He is naturally more loved, and his people are generally well disposed towards his continued rule. In the antiquity of such a reign, the motives for radical change are lost, for one innovation always leaves the toothing stone for the next to follow. However, the geometry of states shifts into a realm of extreme volatility when we examine the new principality. If the acquisition is not entirely new, but is grafted onto an existing state, forming what we term the mixed principality, it faces an inherent structural difficulty. The subjects of a newly conquered land will change their rulers willingly, driven by the deceptive hope that any new master must surely be an improvement over the old. This idealism is quickly shattered by the clinical reality of conquest, as they soon discover through bitter experience that their condition has only deteriorated. This decline is a natural necessity, for a new prince is always compelled to burden his new subjects with the presence of his soldiery and 1,000 other hardships. In the very act of seizing power, you transform everyone you have injured into a permanent enemy. Simultaneously, you cannot retain the loyalty of the friends who assisted your rise, for you can never satisfy their hunger for reward as fully as they expected. You are unable to apply strong medicines against these former allies, for you are bound by the obligation of their initial support. Regardless of the strength of your armed forces, you possess a constant and vital need for the goodwill of the natives when entering a new province. It was through the neglect of these iron laws that King Louis XII of France occupied Milan with rapid ease, and lost it with even greater speed. To turn him out the first time, the mere forces of Duke Lodovico on the borders were enough, as the people realized they had been deceived in their hopes for future benefit. Yet we must observe that a rebellious province, once regained a second time, is not so easily lost, as the prince uses the occasion to clear out suspects and fortify his weak points. To drive the French from Milan the second time, it required the concerted effort of the entire world to defeat their armies and expel them from the Italian peninsula. Dominions annexed to an ancient state are either of the same country and language as the conqueror, or they are foreign and distinct. If they share the same language and have not been accustomed to self-governance, they can be held with relative ease. Secure possession requires only two primary conditions: the total extermination of the former prince's family line and the preservation of existing laws and taxes. When the old conditions are maintained and customs remain similar, different peoples will eventually live quietly together as a single body. We see this cohesion in Brittany, Burgundy, Gascony, and Normandy, which have remained bound to the French crown for centuries. However, the prince who acquires a territory differing in language, customs, or laws faces an immense and treacherous challenge. To hold such a state requires both the favor of fortune and the raw, energetic prowess of a leader who understands the spirit of the times. In these foreign lands, the prince must find ways to weaken the powerful and become the head and defender the less powerful neighbours. He must ensure that no foreigner, as powerful as himself, gains a footing there. For such a figure will always be invited in by the discontented. Time drives everything before it, and the wise prince prepares for future troubles with every energy. For when foreseen, they are easily remedied. Like the physicians who treat a hectic fever, the ruler must detect the malady in its infancy before it becomes easy to detect but impossible to cure. The Romans understood this geometry perfectly, never allowing troubles to grow for the sake of avoiding war, for they knew war is only deferred to the advantage of others. They chose to fight Philip and Antiochus in Greece, rather than await them in Italy, relying on their own valour and prudence, rather than the shifting winds of chance. But the most profound difficulty arises when a prince acquires a territory completely foreign to his own. Chapter 3. The French Blunder. To comprehend the fatal mechanics of foreign conquest, we must turn our clinical scalpel to the disastrous Italian campaign of King Louis XII. When a prince acquires a new state that is grafted onto his ancient dominions, he is immediately confronted by an inherent structural difficulty. Men will willingly change their rulers, driven by the seductive but false hope that a new master will inevitably improve their brutal condition. They quickly discover through bitter experience that they have merely traded one form of misery for a considerably worse oppression. This inevitable decline is a natural necessity, as a new prince is perpetually forced to burden his subjects with his standing soldiery. Through the violent act of seizing power, the prince instantly creates enemies of all those whose property and lives he has injured. Simultaneously, he finds it impossible to maintain the loyal friendship of those native factions who open the gates for his arrival. He can never satisfy their ravenous expectations for reward, nor can he employ the strong medicine of cruelty against them due to his obligation. It was through the tragic ignorance of these iron laws that King Louis was brought into the fractured Italian peninsula. He was drawn across the Alps by the blind ambition of the Venetians, who sought to leverage French military might to acquire Lombardy. Upon acquiring this territory, Louis immediately regained the formidable reputation that the previous French crown had squandered. Genoa yielded to his power, the Florentines sought his friendship, and a multitude of minor lords rushed forward to offer their allegiance. Only in the shadow of this overwhelming French supremacy did the Venetians realize the immense rashness of their original invitation. Consider with what little difficulty King Louis could have maintained this dominant position had he observed the fundamental geometry of power. He needed only to keep his new, numerous, and highly timid friends secure and protected beneath his overwhelming military canopy. These minor powers were paralyzed by their terror of the church and would have been forced to remain permanently tethered to the French crown. Instead, the moment he entered Milan, he executed the precise opposite of this logical and necessary strategy. He committed his first and most devastating error by willfully assisting Pope Alexander VI in occupying the Romagna. He violently alienated his new friends while aggressively aggrandizing the Church by adding immense temporal power to its spiritual authority. By elevating the spiritual authority of the papacy with such aggressive temporal might, he unknowingly forged the very weapon that would later expel the French from Italy. Having committed this prime error, he was chained to its logical consequences, eventually forcing him to march deeper into Italy merely to halt the Pope. As if elevating the Church to dangerous heights was not enough, he then coveted the Kingdom of Naples and divided it with the King of Spain. Where Louis had been the supreme arbiter of Italian destiny, he voluntarily introduced a powerful associate to whom the malcontents could turn. Instead of leaving a pensioner king upon the Neapolitan throne, he installed a monarch who possessed the military strength to drive Louis out in return. The desire to acquire is a deeply natural impulse, and when men with the capacity to conquer do so, they will always be praised. But when a ruler lacks the raw power to achieve his desires, yet stubbornly insists on attempting them, he courts nothing but disaster. Furthermore, a prince who acquires foreign lands must go and reside there in person to make his position secure and durable. If one is on the spot, political disorders are seen as they spring up, and the ruler can quickly and decisively remedy them. By failing to reside in Italy, Louis committed his fourth error, allowing his distant officials to pillage the country and exasperate the subjects. His fifth error was the failure to establish colonies, which serve as the inexpensive keys to holding a state without the ruinous cost of an army. Instead, Louis relied on armed garrisons that consumed all the income of the state and turned his acquisition into a massive loss. He proceeded to crown these monumental blunders with a sixth error by aggressively stripping the Venetians of their remaining dominions. Having already altered the balance of power so disastrously, he should never have consented to the ruin of the Venetian Republic. As long as the Venetians remained powerful, their ambition would have kept the other predators away from the borders of Lombardy. If weak minds argue that King Louis surrendered territory simply to avoid a war, I offer a cold and immutable counter-argument. A strategic blunder must never be perpetrated under the cowardly guise of avoiding armed conflict. War is never truly avoided by such desperate concessions. It is merely deferred to your ultimate and profound disadvantage. King Louis lost Lombardy because he failed to observe a single one of the fundamental conditions required to hold a conquered country. I discussed this precise matter at Nantes with the Cardinal of Rouen, while Cesare Borgia was ruthlessly occupying the Romagna. When the Cardinal sneered that the Italians understood nothing of war, I told him that the French understood absolutely nothing of statecraft. If the French possessed any true understanding of power, they would never have allowed the Church to reach such an overwhelming magnitude. From this bloody autopsy of the French campaign, we extract a supreme and general rule of political mechanics. He who is the cause of another becoming powerful is the absolute architect of his own destruction. Such predominancy is always built either through astuteness or raw force, and both of these qualities are eternally distrusted by the one who is raised to power. To avoid such an ignominious ruin, a prince must shift his gaze from the tragic errors of recent history. He must look beyond the immediate horizon and study the ancient enduring structures of the East and the West. Chapter 4. The Sultan's Shadow. We must compare the monolithic power of the Turk against the fractured authority of the French kingdom. These two principalities stand as the supreme archetypes of governance, illustrating the two distinct ways a state may be constructed. A kingdom may be governed by a single prince, surrounded by a body of servants who assist him not by right, but by his grace and permission. Or it may be governed by a prince and a constellation of ancient barons who hold their rank not by the ruler's favor, but by the antiquity of their blood. In the monarchy of the Turk, the Sultan is the sole master, and all others are merely his bondsmen. He divides his kingdom into administrative units, or sonjaks, and dispatches his administrators to rule them as he sees fit. He shifts and changes these officials at his pleasure, stripping them of power as easily as he grants it. Because they are entirely dependent on his will, they possess no independent authority and no loyal subjects of their own. In stark contrast, the King of France stands in the midst of an ancient and crowded multitude of lords. These barons are acknowledged by their own subjects and are beloved by them. They possess their own prerogatives, their own fortified lands, and their own hereditary rights. The king cannot strip these lords of their privileges without placing his own position in grave peril. He who considers these two disparate structures will recognize the immense gulf between them. To seize the state of the Turk is a task of extreme difficulty, but once it is conquered, it is held with great ease. The difficulty in seizing the Turkish kingdom arises because the usurper cannot be called in by the princes of that state. He cannot hope to facilitate his enterprise by corrupting the ministers around the throne. Because these servants are slaves and creatures of the Sultan, they are not easily bribed. Even if they were corrupted, they could not carry the people with them, for they hold no personal sway over the populace. Therefore, he who attacks the Turk must bear in mind that he will find a united front. He must rely entirely on his own strength and the force of his arms, rather than on the disorders of his enemy. But once the Turk has been routed in the field and his armies shattered beyond repair, the difficulty vanishes. There remains nothing to fear but the family of the prince. Once the bloodline of the ruler is extinguished, there is no one left to fear, for the others have no credit with the people. Just as the conqueror had nothing to hope from them before his victory, he has nothing to fear from them after it. The opposite is true in kingdoms governed like that of France. You can enter such a state with relative ease by gaining over some baron of the kingdom. In a decentralized state, there are always malcontents and men who desire innovation. These men can open the gates of the realm to you and render your victory rapid and easy. But when you wish to hold what you have acquired, you encounter infinite difficulties. You are threatened both by those who have assisted you and by those you have oppressed. It is not enough to simply exterminate the family of the prince. The lords who remain will make themselves the heads of fresh movements and new rebellions. Since you can neither satisfy their ambitions nor destroy them all, you will lose that state whenever time brings the opportunity. This distinction explains why the kingdom of Darius, conquered by Alexander the Great, did not rebel against his successors. Alexander became master of Asia in a few short years and died before he had fully settled his conquest. It would have been reasonable to expect the whole empire to revolt, yet his successors maintained themselves, facing no other difficulty than that which arose from their own personal ambitions. This was possible because the nature of Darius's government was similar to that of the Turk. It was necessary for Alexander to overthrow him completely in the field and take the country from him. After this victory, with Darius dead, the state remained secure to Alexander for the reasons we have discussed. Had his successors remained united, they could have enjoyed their vast empire in indolence and ease. No tumults arose in that kingdom, except those they provoked among themselves. But states constituted like France cannot be held with such tranquility. This structural reality explains the frequent rebellions against the Romans in Spain, France, and Greece. As long as the memory of the many principalities in those states endured, the Romans held an insecure possession. Only when the power and duration of the empire extinguished those memories did the Romans become secure possessors. Even then, when fighting amongst themselves, the Roman generals were able to draw support from those provinces only because the ancient lords had been wiped out. When these distinct structures are understood, it is no longer a matter of wonder that Alexander held the East so easily. Nor is it surprising that Pyrrhus and many others found it so difficult to preserve their acquisitions. This difference is not occasioned by the greater or lesser ability of the conqueror. It is determined entirely by the uniformity or the diversity of the subject state. If structures define the state, it is the method of governance that defines the city. Chapter 5. The Memory of Liberty. If structures define the state, it is the method of governance that defines the city. We now confront the most volatile entity in the geometry of power, the city that has lived under its own laws. When a prince acquires a state accustomed to freedom, he is attempting to domesticate a wild organism. The political anatomy of a free city is fundamentally hostile to foreign dominion. It breathes a different air, governed by ancient civic reflexes and the habit of self-determination. To master such an entity, the prince must cast aside all illusions of peaceful integration. The clinical reality of statecraft dictates there are only 3 available courses of action for the conqueror. The first is to ruin it. The second is to reside there in person. The third is to permit the city to live under its own laws, drawing a tribute and establishing within it an oligarchy which will keep the state friendly to you. Let us examine the third option, the establishment of an oligarchy, for it is often the most tempting to the sentimental prince. By creating a proxy government composed of select citizens, the prince attempts to govern through a velvet glove. This newly elevated oligarchy knows perfectly well that it has been created by the prince. It understands that it cannot stand without his constant friendship and military shadow. Consequently, this puppet regime will do its utmost to support him. If a prince truly wishes to keep a city accustomed to freedom without destroying it, he will hold it more easily by the means of its own citizens than in any other way. It is a calculated delegation of power, designed to mask the face of the conqueror behind the familiar features of local magistrates. Yet history, the unforgiving judge of political theory, reveals the fatal fragility of this approach. We look to the ancients to see the violent collapse of this middle path. The Spartans, a highly disciplined military power, attempted to hold Athens and Thebes by establishing precisely such oligarchies. They sought to control the political machinery without breaking the physical and psychological foundations of the cities themselves. Despite their overwhelming supremacy, the Spartans lost both Athens and Thebes. The proxy governments were swept away by the inevitable resurgence of local ambition and civic pride. Contrast this failure with the terrifying efficiency of the Romans when the Roman Republic sought to hold Capua, Carthage, and Numantia. They did not rely on the fragile loyalty of local oligarchs, nor did they trust in the slow assimilation of tribute. They dismantled them. They tore down the walls, shattered the civic institutions, and dispersed the populations. Because they applied this ultimate violence, they did not lose them. The Roman strategy was not born of blind vengeance. It was a cold, calculated application of political necessity. The Romans eventually attempted to hold Greece by imitating the Spartan method. They wished to make Greece free and permit its ancient laws, seeking to govern through influence. They failed spectacularly. To finally secure their hold over the Greek territories, the Romans were ultimately compelled to dismantle many cities in that country. The surgical autopsy of these events reveals a singular, chilling axiom. In truth, there is no safe way to retain a city accustomed to freedom, otherwise than by ruining it. Why is this absolute destruction so mathematically necessary? Because he who becomes master of a city, accustomed to freedom, and does not destroy it, may expect to be destroyed by it. In every rebellion, the subjugated city has a rallying point that transcends the physical presence of the conqueror. It has the watchword of liberty. It has the memory of its ancient privileges. These are not empty words. They are an ideological pathogen, dormant in the blood of the conquered. Neither the passage of time nor the distribution of new benefits will ever cause a free people to forget that name. Whatever a prince may do, whatever defenses he may build, the citizens never forget. Unless the inhabitants are aggressively dispersed, they will instantly rally to the watchword of liberty at every conceivable opportunity. We see this vividly in the case of Pisa. After 100 years of being held in bondage by the Florentines, the Pisans seized the first chance to throw off the yoke, driven by a century-old memory of their former independence. The memory of freedom is indestructible. We must sharply distinguish the conquest of a free city from the conquest of a principality. When cities are accustomed to living under a prince, their political psychology is fundamentally different. If the bloodline of their former prince is completely exterminated, the populace is paralyzed. On the one hand, they are accustomed to obedience. On the other, lacking their old master, they are utterly incapable of agreeing to make one from amongst themselves. They have no experience in self-government. For this reason, the subjects of a former principality are very slow to take up arms. A new prince can step into the vacuum and secure his hold over them with remarkable ease. But in republics, there is a vastly different political metabolism. There is more vitality. There is a greater simmering hatred. There is a relentless, burning desire for vengeance. The citizens of a republic possess an active political consciousness that will never permit them to allow the memory of their former liberty to rest. The ghosts of their past independence haunt the streets, whispering treason into every ear. The conqueror of a republic sleeps on a volcano, guaranteed to erupt. The pragmatic ruler must look upon this reality without moral hesitation. To preserve his state, he must choose between the only two secure options. He must either pack his court and go to reside there in person, placing his boot directly on the neck of the subjugated city to extinguish the sparks of rebellion. Or he must apply the Roman solution. He must shatter the city's identity and scatter its people to the winds. The clinical truth is brutal, but it is absolute. The safest way is to destroy them or to reside there. For those who cannot destroy a city, they must rely on their own prowess to create a new one. Chapter 6. The Armed Visionary. It is a foundational truth of human nature that men almost always walk in the paths beaten by others, acting entirely by imitation. A wise man ought always to follow the paths beaten by great men, and to imitate those who have been supreme. Yet, because a man is rarely able to keep strictly to the ways of others or attain their exact power, a wise ruler must act with the calculated precision of a clever archer. When an archer designs to hit a distant mark, knowing the absolute limits of his bow, he aims much higher than the target to ensure the arrow strikes its true destination. We must apply this rigorous geometry to the entirely new principality, where the difficulty of maintaining power corresponds precisely to the raw ability of the man who acquired it. To rise from a private station to the rank of a sovereign presupposes either extraordinary genius or the fickle favor of fortune. While either element mitigates early friction, the cold reality of history demonstrates that he who relies least on fortune establishes himself the strongest. We must examine those who forge their own supremacy through pure ability, finding the most clinical examples in Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus. Upon examining their actions and their lives, it becomes glaringly obvious that they owed absolutely nothing to fortune beyond mere opportunity. Fortune provided them only with the unshaped material, which their strategic minds then violently molded into a new political reality. Without that specific opportunity, their immense powers of mind would have been extinguished. Yet without those powers, the opportunity would have come in vain. It was structurally necessary for Moses to find the Israelites enslaved by the Egyptians, so they would be desperate enough to follow him out of bondage. Romulus had to be abandoned at birth to become the hardened founder of Rome, just as Cyrus needed to find the Persians deeply discontented with the effeminate Medes. Theseus, likewise, could never have manifested his true martial ability had he not found the Athenians fractured and dispersed. These perfectly timed opportunities made these men highly fortunate, but it was their own supreme ability that allowed them to recognize the moment and ennoble their nations. Those who become princes through such valorous ways acquire their domains with immense difficulty, but they maintain them with clinical ease. The severe difficulties they face stem directly from the new rules and methods they are forced to introduce to guarantee their state's absolute security. There is absolutely nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in introducing a new order of things. The innovator instantly manufactures bitter, partisan enemies of all those who thrived and profited under the old conditions. Thus, whenever the hostile factions have the opportunity to attack the new prince, they do so with the aggressive and ruthless zeal of partisans. Simultaneously, he finds only lukewarm defenders in those who might do well under the new regime, driven by their fear of the old guard and a fundamental incredulity of the untested. To dissect this mechanical problem of power, we must inquire whether these innovators depend on persuasion or if they possess the means to apply raw force. When they are dependent on others and rely solely on prayers, they always succeed badly and compass absolutely nothing. But when they can rely securely on their own strength and use violence to compel obedience, they are rarely endangered. This reveals the most unyielding axiom of political history. All armed prophets have conquered, and all unarmed prophets have been utterly destroyed. The nature of the public is dangerously fickle. While it is easy to persuade them of a new idea, it is profoundly difficult to keep their minds fixed in that persuasion. Therefore, a prince must take calculated measures to ensure that when the people inevitably stop believing, he can force them to believe at the point of a sword. If the ancient founders had been unarmed, they could never have enforced their constitutions against a shifting populace for any significant duration. We witness this exact tragedy in Florence, with the spectacular ruin of Fra Girolamo Savonarola, who was destroyed alongside his new order the moment the multitude ceased to believe. He possessed no martial means to keep his loyal followers steadfast, nor could he violently compel the unbelievers to submit to his visions. Such unarmed visionaries face monumental difficulties in their ascent, for all their dangers are concentrated on the steep climb to power. Yet, if they possess sufficient military ability and overcome these initial hurdles, they exterminate their envious rivals and command deep, permanent respect. They will continue afterwards to be powerful, secure, honored, and fundamentally unassailable in their newly forged dominions. To these towering historical figures, we must add a lesser, yet perfectly symmetrical example. Hero the Syracusan. This man rose from a completely private station to become the absolute Prince of Syracuse, owing nothing to fortune except raw opportunity. Finding themselves brutally oppressed, the Syracusans selected him as their military captain, and through his tactical brilliance, he was rewarded with the principality. His ability was so supreme, even as a mere citizen, that chroniclers noted he lacked nothing to be a king except a physical kingdom. Hero understood that borrowed power is a fatal illusion, so he immediately abolished the old mercenary soldiery and meticulously organized a new one based on his own forces. He ruthlessly discarded all old alliances and forged entirely new ones, ensuring every diplomatic connection served his own strategic architecture. Because he possessed his own loyal soldiers and his own dependent allies, he was able to build an unshakable sovereign edifice upon this foundation. While he endured immense friction in acquiring his state, the bedrock of his own arms ensured he had little difficulty in keeping it securely. But what happens when the formidable machinery of power is not earned through ability, but rather gifted effortlessly by the capricious hands of fortune? Chapter 7. The Tragedy of Valentino. Those who rise to sovereignty solely by the favorable winds of good fortune experience very little friction in their ascent. Their profound difficulties only begin when they reach the top and are forced to maintain their precarious elevation. Such states are like rapid growths in nature, lacking the deep roots necessary to survive a severe storm. Unless the prince can rapidly lay those vital foundations, the first political tempest will overthrow him. To examine the tragic mechanics of this dynamic, we must dissect the career of Cesare Borgia, known to the people as Duke Valentino. He stands as the supreme historical exemplar of the Prince of Fortune. He acquired his vast state entirely through the overwhelming political influence of his father, Pope Alexander VI. Yet Cesare was no mere opportunistic parasite. He possessed a remarkably lofty spirit, far-reaching strategic aims, and a cold, calculating brilliance. He immediately set to work laying the most solid and ruthless foundations for his future sovereign independence. The Romagna he inherited was a chaotic wasteland, plundered by weak and corrupt masters. It was a fractured territory, choked with violent factions, widespread robbery, and civil lawlessness. Cesare recognized that to forcefully pacify such a savage environment, he required an instrument of absolute terror. He appointed Messer Ramiro d'Orco, a swift and exceptionally cruel administrator, granting him limitless authority. Ramiro fell upon the province, crushing the unruly factions and restoring obedience through sheer violence. Order was brutally established, but Cesare knew such severe cruelty generates a deep, simmering hatred. He needed to retain the benefits of Ramiro's terror while washing his own hands of the butcher's work. To clear his name and win the devotion of his subjects, he executed a masterpiece of clinical political theatre. One morning, the terrified citizens of Cesena awoke to find Ramiro d'Orco hacked cleanly in two in the centre of the public piazza. The severed corpse was deliberately displayed alongside a wooden execution block and a blood-stained knife. This spectacle simultaneously satisfied the people's desire for vengeance and left them dismayed by the Duke's raw power. Having pacified the populace, Cesare turned his cold intellect toward the mercenaries who had initially assisted his expansion. He recognized that the forces of the Orsini and the Vitelli were inherently unreliable and secretly hostile to his greatness. When these powerful aristocratic networks realized Cesare's relentless expansion threatened their existence, they formed a desperate conspiracy. Cesare did not respond with immediate, open warfare, for he understood that deception is often more lethal than artillery. He retreated behind a mask of dissimulation, utilizing every diplomatic wile to conceal his true intentions. He offered generous terms of reconciliation, showering his rivals with lavish gifts and flattering promises. His performance was so convincing that their own simplicity and greed lured them directly into his trap at Sinigalia. Under the guise of a celebratory reunion, the rival captains confidently rode into the town to pay their respects. The moment they were isolated from their troops, Cesare's trusted lieutenants seized them. With clinical efficiency, he had the leaders of the Orsini and Vitelli factions strangled to death. By aggressively exterminating the heads of these rival houses, Cesare fundamentally secured his military independence. He systematically anticipated every catastrophic threat that might follow the inevitable death of his father. He methodically eradicated the bloodlines of the lords he had despoiled, eliminating any future pretext for hostile papal intervention. He heavily bribed the Roman nobility to act as a permanent, stabilizing check against the ambitions of the next pontiff. He packed the College of Cardinals with his loyalists, ensuring he would dictate the papal succession. His strategic architecture was flawless, his execution was without error, and his ambition was boundless. He was fully prepared to resist the first massive shock of his father's passing. But the Duke's magnificent sovereign edifice contained one fatal, utterly uncontrollable vulnerability. Pope Alexander died of fever a mere 5 years after Cesare had first drawn his sword. The Duke found himself abruptly abandoned, with his other massive conquest suspended precariously in the air. Worse still, he was caught squarely between two immensely powerful and openly hostile foreign armies. But the ultimate blow was delivered by an invisible enemy that no military genius could outmaneuver. At the precise moment of his father's death, Cesare himself was struck down by a severe, paralyzing illness. The Duke later confessed to Machiavelli that he had planned for every conceivable disaster that might accompany the Pope's demise. He had engineered a foolproof remedy for every imaginable political and military complication. He had never once anticipated that at the critical hour of succession, he too would be at the edge of death. This is the supreme, inescapable tragedy of the Prince of Fortune. You can possess limitless valor, deploy flawless cunning, and build the most structurally secure foundations imaginable. You can play the calculating fox to discover the snares, and the ferocious lion to terrify the wolves. But if your power is ultimately dependent on the volatile, shifting alignment of external forces, you remain forever a hostage to unpredictable chance. Cesare Borgia's ultimate ruin was not caused by a failure of his own piercing intellect or a lack of decisive martial ferocity. He was brought low by the extraordinary and extreme malignity of a cosmic fortune he simply could not command. Even a man of such singular, terrifying brilliance can be completely unmade by a wickedness that resides entirely outside his own control. Chapter 8. The Path of Infamy. Even a man of such singular, terrifying brilliance as Cesare Borgia can be completely unmade by a cosmic wickedness that resides entirely outside his own control. But while the Duke Valentino was ultimately undone by the malignity of fortune, there is another, darker path to sovereignty that relies on a wickedness entirely of human manufacture. A prince may rise to absolute power, not by the unpredictable favor of fortune or conventional ability, but through avenues of intolerable violence and calculated betrayal. We must examine the architecture of infamy, for history demonstrates that empires can indeed be acquired through absolute, unvarnished crime. Agathocles the Sicilian clawed his way up from the most abject and low-born conditions imaginable to become the king of Syracuse. He was the son of a humble potter, and throughout every phase of his changing fortunes, he led a life marked by consistent and calculated infamy. Devoting himself entirely to the art of war, he rose steadily through the ranks until he was appointed praetor of the great city of Syracuse. On a chosen morning, Agathocles assembled the people and the august senate of Syracuse under the convenient pretext of discussing vital affairs of the Republic. At a prearranged signal, his loyal soldiers violently descended upon the assembly and slaughtered every single senator, along with the richest citizens of the city. When the butchery was complete and the streets ran red, he seized the princedom of Syracuse and held it without facing a single civil commotion. Yet, we must remain ruthlessly objective in our analysis and recognize the absolute limits of his achievement. It cannot be called virtue to slaughter your own citizens, betray your friends, and live without faith, mercy, or religion. Such barbaric methods may undoubtedly secure a vast and powerful empire, but they can never win true, immortal glory. We must now turn our clinical gaze to our own times, observing a modern equivalent forged during the papacy of Alexander VI. The specimen in question is Oliverotto da Fermo, a man whose violent ambition perfectly mirrored his total lack of moral constraint. Oliverotto was raised by his maternal uncle, a prominent citizen named Giovanni Fogliani, and sent away to study the art of war under the condottiere Pagolo Vitelli. But the prospect of serving under the command of others soon began to chafe at his immense, restless ambition. He enlisted the aid of a few traitorous citizens of Fermo, to whom the slavery of their own fatherland was dearer than its liberty. He wrote a carefully crafted letter to his uncle, Giovanni Fogliani, stating that he had been away from home for many years and now wished to inspect his patrimony. The uncle, suspecting absolutely nothing, caused Oliverotto to be received with great fanfare by the people of Fermo, lodging the prodigal son in his own grand house. He then hosted a highly solemn and elaborate banquet, explicitly inviting Giovanni Fogliani and all the principal chiefs of the city. When the rich viands were consumed, Oliverotto artfully steered the conversation toward grave political matters, discussing the rising greatness of Pope Alexander. He declared that such sensitive matters should be discussed in a more private chamber, and the unsuspecting dignitaries dutifully followed him into the fatal trap. No sooner were they seated than Oliverotto's hidden soldiers burst from their concealed positions and slaughtered every single man present, including his own uncle. Oliverotto immediately mounted his horse, aggressively besieged the chief magistrate in the government palace, and triumphantly crowned himself the absolute prince. Oliverotto allowed himself to be outmaneuvered by the superior cunning of Cesare Borgia during the infamous trap at Sinigalia. Exactly 1 year after committing his spectacular parricide, he was unceremoniously strangled to death next to Vitellozzo. In analyzing these brutal histories, a profound and necessary question naturally arises regarding the precise mechanics of cruelty. How is it that men like Agathocles, after committing infinite treacheries, can live securely in their own countries for decades without facing rebellion? The answer to this mechanical paradox lies in a clinical distinction. It depends entirely on whether the severities are used properly or improperly. Cruelty may be called properly used when it is applied swiftly, comprehensively, and at a single, decisive stroke to ensure absolute security. The prince must execute his necessary violence all at once, and then he must never persist in the terror. Improperly used cruelties are those which might be relatively few at the beginning, but which multiply and escalate over time rather than decrease. It is structurally impossible for those who follow the second escalating path to maintain their precarious grip on power. When seizing a state, the usurper must therefore conduct a cold, mathematical inventory of all the injuries he is absolutely required to inflict. He must inflict every single one of these necessary injuries at the exact same time, so that he does not have to renew them on a daily basis. By refusing to keep the blade hovering over their necks, he allows the population to settle and forget their initial trauma. The ruler who acts otherwise is condemned to keep the bloody knife forever in his hand, unable to ever rely on his terrified subjects. This is the immutable law of political violence. Injuries must be done all at one time, so that, being tasted less, they offend less. Conversely, benefits and rewards must be given out slowly, drop by drop, so that their sweet flavor may be savored for the longest possible time. A prince must live among his people in such a consistent manner that no unexpected circumstance forces him to alter his behavior. If he is suddenly compelled by troubled times to apply harsh measures, it will be far too late, for his cruelty will be seen as an act of sheer desperation. The citizens will interpret this abrupt severity as an aggressive panic, responding not with obedience, but with a fatal, simmering hatred. Chapter 9. The People's Shield. When absolute wickedness is not the chosen path, a leader may ascend through an entirely different mechanism. He may rise to power not by deploying intolerable violence, but by harnessing the favor of his own fellow citizens to forge a civil principality. Attaining this position demands a highly specific, calculated asset, which we term a happy shrewdness. The civil principality is forged through the support of one of two fundamental factions. Every single city is divided by two entirely opposite and irreconcilable political humors. These two factions are the common people and the entrenched nobility. The common people desire only to exist without being endlessly oppressed by the ruling class. The nobles are driven by an aggressive, predatory appetite to dominate and oppress the masses. From this volatile collision of desires, a principality, a free republic, or total anarchy must emerge. A principality is created either by the calculated maneuvering of the nobles or the defensive hope of the people. When the nobles realize they can no longer withstand the sheer weight of the masses, they elevate one of their own peers. They crown him as prince in order to freely vent their own ambitions under the absolute protection of his shadow. Conversely, finding themselves unable to resist the crushing pressure of the nobility, the people seek a champion. They elevate a singular figure to sovereign power, so his authority might serve as an impenetrable shield. Yet the prince who ascends through the favor of the nobles occupies a deeply precarious throne. He immediately finds himself surrounded by powerful men who still consider themselves his absolute equals. Because they view him merely as a peer, he can neither rule them nor manage them to his own liking. He cannot satisfy the relentless demands of the nobles without inevitably committing injuries against others. However, the prince who reaches sovereignty through the sheer force of popular favor stands entirely alone. He is surrounded by very few individuals who are not already conditioned to instantly obey his commands. Unlike the nobles, the people simply demand that the heavy boot of oppression be lifted from their necks. Furthermore, the strategic math of survival heavily favors the populace over the aristocrats. A prince can never truly secure himself against a hostile population because they are simply too numerous. He can, however, easily secure himself against a hostile nobility because their isolated faction is vastly smaller. The absolute worst consequence a prince may suffer from a hostile populace is total abandonment. But hostile nobles present a far more active and lethal threat to his survival. When they sense danger, these astute aristocrats will actively conspire to orchestrate his ruin. A prince is structurally condemned to live his entire life surrounded by the exact same people. He is never compelled to tolerate the exact same nobles, possessing the absolute authority to make and unmake these lords every single day. Therefore, the pragmatic ruler must evaluate the nobility through a cold, binary lens. Those who bind themselves securely to his fortune and lack a rapacious nature should be greatly honored. Those who refuse to tether themselves to the prince's destiny must be analyzed with extreme vigilance. Ambitious nobles who remain aloof are dangerous enemies who value their own advancement above the state. For a prince elevated by the people, the primary directive is to fiercely maintain their enduring friendship. The prince who takes power through the nobles faces a far more urgent and critical task. He must immediately pivot to win the populace over by taking them under his absolute protection. Men become far more fiercely bound to their benefactor when they receive unexpected good from a perceived enemy. Without the firm foundation of popular goodwill, a prince has absolutely no remedy when adversity strikes. Consider the historical archetype of Nabis, the fierce prince of the Spartans. He successfully sustained a massive attack from all of Greece because he had secured his people. Let no weak mind attempt to impugn this clinical reality by citing a deeply flawed and trite proverb. It is often foolishly said that he who builds his foundation on the people builds entirely on mud. This proverb is only accurate when applied to a private citizen who overestimates his own political leverage. A sovereign prince who builds upon the people, however, constructs an impenetrable fortress. He must be a man of genuine courage, possessing a commanding presence and relentless resolve. By keeping the population energized, he will never find himself betrayed by their shifting moods. The geometry of power faces extreme volatility when a civil principality attempts to shift its internal form. The transition from a civil order to an absolute, unmitigated autocracy is fraught with lethal peril. When governing through proxy magistrates, the architecture of the state is vastly weaker and inherently insecure. In troubled times, these elevated officials can destroy the government by refusing to enforce his laws. In the chaos of a tumult, the isolated prince suddenly loses the ability to exercise absolute authority. The citizens, conditioned to receive orders from magistrates, will completely ignore his direct commands. When the state is calm, every man makes extravagant promises and swears to die for the sovereign. But when the political weather turns violent, the prince will find a deadly scarcity of loyal defenders. This specific experiment in loyalty is profoundly dangerous, precisely because it can only be tested once. Therefore, a truly wise ruler must engineer a brilliantly calculated system of systemic dependency. He must design a political reality where the citizens perpetually feel an absolute need for his leadership. Only by maintaining this structural necessity will he guarantee their unwavering fidelity in the darkest of times. Regardless of who originally supports the prince, the ultimate strength of the entire state must eventually be measured by its physical walls and its martial resolve. Chapter 10. The German Depot. It is mathematically necessary to consider a fundamental metric when examining the true character of any principality. We must clinically determine if a prince possesses the raw power to support himself entirely with his own resources. We must calculate if he can stand alone, or if he is perpetually dependent on the dangerous assistance of others. The ultimate sovereign is the man who commands an overwhelming abundance of men and money. He can raise a massive, disciplined army to join battle against any aggressor in the open field. But the harsh reality of statecraft dictates that many princes entirely lack this terrifying martial capacity. They simply cannot show themselves against a superior enemy in the unforgiving arena of open combat. When the invading armies cross their borders, these weaker rulers are forced into a desperate retreat. They must abandon the sprawling countryside and seek shelter behind the stone architecture of their central cities. Their only viable course of action is to relentlessly provision and fortify their core stronghold. A prince who perfectly fortifies his city will rarely find himself the target of a prolonged siege. Human nature is universally averse to military enterprises that are visibly fraught with tedious difficulties. Aggressive conquerors seek rapid victories and easy plunder, not grinding wars of logistical attrition. If a ruler maintains an impenetrable fortress and actively avoids the hatred of his people, his security is absolute. To understand the mechanics of this defensive perfection, we must examine the free cities of Germany. These German municipalities exist as fiercely independent organisms within the broader political ecosystem. They control very little territory beyond the immediate protective shadow of their own massive walls. They yield temporary obedience to the Holy Roman Emperor only when it suits their calculated self-interest. They remain entirely fearless of both imperial authority and the predatory ambitions of their neighbors. They are ringed by incredibly deep ditches and protected by walls of immense, unyielding thickness. They maintain an intimidating and perfectly positioned arsenal of heavy artillery to shatter approaching ranks. To neutralize the biological vulnerability of starvation, they meticulously maintain massive public depots. They systematically stockpile enough food, drink, and firewood to comfortably last an entire year. This clinical foresight entirely eliminates the threat of famine from the attacker's strategic equation. Idleness breeds dangerous despair, and unchecked despair inevitably mutates into violent civic rebellion. To keep the populace perfectly quiet and focused, the state must engineer continuous mental occupation. The citizens are kept perpetually busy, their anxious minds distracted from the terror lurking outside. Furthermore, these pragmatic republics hold rigorous military exercises in the highest possible repute. They enforce strict civic ordinances to ensure their citizens remain physically hardened and martially competent. A city structured with such paranoid precision transforms itself into a monument of immense frustration. An attacking prince will find his momentum entirely shattered against such unyielding preparation. It is practically impossible for an invading army to maintain a static encampment for an entire year. The shifting seasons, disease, and changing alliances will inevitably force the attacker to abandon the campaign. A cowardly prince might argue that the besieged citizens will eventually lose their patience. To this weak hesitation, the science of statecraft offers a cold and highly decisive answer. A powerful and courageous ruler will masterfully manipulate the fragile psychology of his people. At one carefully chosen moment, he will feed them the comforting hope that the evil will soon pass. At another, he will amplify their terrifying dread of the enemy's unhinged and barbaric cruelty. He will swiftly and adroitly silence any specific subjects who appear too bold or politically disruptive. The besieged citizens are entirely consumed by a fervent, adrenaline-fueled desire to defend their sovereign territory. Therefore, the prince has absolutely no logical reason to hesitate or display any sign of weakness. As the grueling days pass and their initial fiery resolve begins to cool, the damage is already permanent. Their ancestral homes are already reduced to ash, and their fertile fields are already scorched earth. The devastating ills have been incurred, and there is no longer any possible remedy for their loss. The citizens realize they have sacrificed their entire livelihoods specifically for the defense of their prince. This shared, catastrophic trauma paradoxically binds the surviving subjects much closer to their ruler. The prince now appears to be under a massive, unbreakable debt of obligation to his ruined subjects. If this dynamic is managed with clinical precision, the horrific defense becomes a powerful engine of unity. A truly wise prince will easily keep the minds of his citizens steadfast from the first day to the last. He must only ensure that he never fails to support and protect them within the safety of the fortified walls. Through this rigid discipline, a physically weak state transforms its vulnerability into an impenetrable shield. The German model proves that survival does not always require an overwhelming offensive military strength. It requires a ruthless, unsentimental commitment to internal cohesion and meticulous logistical preparation. It demands a highly realistic assessment of one's own absolute limitations in the grand geometry of power. If a prince cannot conquer the broader world, he must focus every ounce of his energy on making his own city unconquerable. Yet there is one extraordinary type of state that completely escapes these brutal, earthly laws of survival. There is a unique dominion that requires neither physical defense nor active governance to endure. Chapter 11. The Vicar of Power. This profound political anomaly actively defies all conventional laws of statecraft and earthly geometry. It is the ecclesiastical principality, a highly unique and fascinating structure acquired through either supreme human capacity or mere good fortune. Yet, once this extraordinary state is acquired, it is maintained with absolute security without the slightest need for either of these vital qualities. These sovereign entities are not anchored by formidable military might or the fragile, shifting goodwill of the subjugated populace. They are entirely sustained by the ancient, deeply rooted ordinances of organized religion. These religious institutions are so incredibly powerful that they preserve their princes in absolute security, regardless of how they behave. The ecclesiastical prince alone possesses vast and wealthy states, which he does not even attempt to physically defend. He commands legions of subjects whom he makes absolutely no active effort to govern or control. Despite this glaring lack of defensive fortifications and administrative oversight, his unguarded states are never wrested from his passive grasp. His completely unruled subjects simply do not care, nor do they possess the capacity to alienate themselves from his authority. Yet they stand in stark contrast to the rest of the world as the only principalities in existence that are truly secure and perpetually happy. Machiavelli observes with calculated irony that these states are exalted and maintained by forces far beyond the reach of the human mind. However, the clinical strategist cannot ignore the massive earthly and temporal power that the Catholic Church eventually wielded over the Italian peninsula. To properly understand this miraculous transformation of power, we must reconstruct the geopolitical chessboard of Italy before the French invasion. The fractured country was tenuously balanced and divided. Among the Pope, the Venetians, the King of Naples, the Duke of Milan, and the Florentines. To keep the papacy perpetually weak and distracted, the other powers skillfully utilized the restless and violently fractured barons of Rome. These Roman nobles were bitterly divided into two fiercely opposing and heavily armed factions, the Orsini and the Colonnesi. The fundamental weakness of the papacy was structurally tied directly to the exceptionally short lifespan of the average pontiff. In the mere 10 years a pope typically lived, he might barely manage to suppress just one of the rebellious Roman factions. For these structural and highly predictable reasons, the temporal power of the pope was held in very little esteem throughout the courts of Italy. Then arose Pope Alexander VI, a man of boundless, calculating ambition and absolute, unyielding moral flexibility. His primary, burning objective was to elevate his ruthless son, Cesare Borgia, the infamous Duke Valentino, to the rank of a sovereign prince. To accomplish this highly personal goal, Alexander willfully broke the ancient Italian stalemates and actively embroiled the peninsula in chaos. Through the aggressive, terrifying actions of the Duke Valentino, the papacy systematically dismantled its oldest domestic enemies and crushed the Roman barons. When Alexander suddenly died, and the Duke Valentino's power spectacularly collapsed due to bad fortune, the Church simply inherited the spoils. The vast, consolidated state that Cesare Borgia had built with so much blood and treachery fell directly into the lap of the papacy. Following this monumental shift in power, the fierce and impetuous Pope Julius II ascended to the papal throne. He found the Church standing upon a newly forged foundation of truly unprecedented temporal and military strength. Julius did not merely maintain this incredible political inheritance, he aggressively and brilliantly improved upon it. He resolved to dramatically expand the papal domains by conquering Bologna, ruining the Venetians, and driving the French out of Italy. He terrified the surviving remnants of the Orsini and Colonnesi factions into submission. With the overwhelming majesty and military weight of the Church. Crucially, he vehemently denied these aristocratic factions the ability to elevate their own family members to the powerful rank of cardinal. Without their own powerful prelates to champion their causes in Rome, the ancient factions remained politically impotent and completely paralyzed. Through this relentless, calculated application of raw military power, the fundamental nature of the papacy was forever altered. The modern pontificate had rapidly transformed itself into a terrifying, heavily armed political monolith, capable of dictating terms to the greatest kings of Europe. Yet the inescapable, clinical truth remained that this holy dominion had been violently forged, using the exact same ruthless methods as any secular kingdom. The heavy spiritual cloak merely obscured the relentless, bloody mechanics of territorial acquisition that had fundamentally built its modern foundation. The history of the Church violently proved that an unarmed prophet is always destroyed, but a heavily armed pope can conquer the world. He who rules an ecclesiastical state possesses the ultimate, unassailable advantage in the grand, unforgiving geometry of power. He benefits immensely from the deep psychological conditioning of religion, which breeds profound, unquestioning obedience in the masses. Simultaneously, he wields the heavy, crushing sword of absolute temporal authority to physically annihilate his earthly rivals. Yet even the mightiest pope, armed with both heavenly decrees and earthly wealth, must recognize that true power cannot be casually delegated. A prince cannot truly rely on the hired armies of others to secure his hard-won domains and protect his life. But no state, sacred or secular, can stand for long if its sword is in the hands of another. Chapter 12. The Hired Sword's Treason. The foundation of every secure state is built upon the dual pillars of good laws and good arms. Therefore, the surgical analysis of sovereignty must inevitably pivot to the precise nature of the military forces a prince employs. A ruler may choose to defend his hard-won territories using his own native troops, hired mercenaries, or borrowed auxiliaries. The clinical truth is that both mercenaries and auxiliaries are fundamentally useless, deeply unreliable, and exceedingly dangerous. If a prince foolishly attempts to anchor his state upon the shifting sands of hired swords, he will never stand secure. These professional soldiers are fiercely ambitious, entirely devoid of military discipline, and bound by absolutely no loyalty. They possess neither the fear of divine judgment nor a shred of honorable fidelity toward the men who pay them. In times of peace, these hired captains ruthlessly rob the state, and in war, they allow the enemy to the same. The singular motivation that keeps these men in the field is a meager stipend of silver and gold. This trivial transaction is tragically insufficient to make a soldier willing to lay down his life for your security. But the moment the harsh reality of war arrives, they either desert their posts or flee the battlefield entirely. We need look no further than the tragic ruin of Italy to witness the fatal consequences of this specific military delusion. For many years, the Italian states rested their fragile hopes exclusively on the supposed prowess of mercenary captains. King Charles of France was permitted to march through the Italian peninsula and conquer it with a piece of chalk. The specific sins that caused this spectacular collapse were the fatal errors of princes who trusted their defense to hired swords. A mercenary captain is either a man of supreme military capability or he is utterly incompetent. If he is truly capable, the prince can never trust him, for he will constantly plot to build his own greatness. He will inevitably seek to oppress the master who hired him, or he will attack others to expand his own power. If the hired captain is entirely lacking in skill, he will simply ruin the prince through sheer tactical incompetence. The only reliable course of action is for the prince to take up the sword himself and personally assume the duties of a captain. We see this tragic pattern clearly when we examine the fate of the Milanese, who enlisted Francesco Sforza to fight the Venetians. After achieving a decisive victory for his employers, Sforza promptly allied with the enemy and violently crushed his Milanese masters. The Florentines similarly rested their survival on the renowned mercenary captain Sir John Hawkwood, escaping ruin only because he failed to conquer. The Venetians experienced this exact structural trap when they expanded their terrestrial empire under the brilliant Carmignuola. Recognizing that he was becoming dangerously lukewarm in his prosecution of their wars, they realized they could no longer use him. Yet they found themselves completely unable to dismiss him without immediately losing all the territories he had previously acquired. To secure their state from his inevitable betrayal, they were forced into the brutal necessity of secretly murdering him. When they later relied on lesser captains, they suffered the spectacular disaster at Vaila, losing 800 years of acquisitions. Mercenary arms inevitably yield conquests that are excruciatingly slow and delayed, but their subsequent losses are shockingly sudden. Through a calculated evasion of danger, these mercenaries systematically drove Italy into a state of absolute slavery and contempt. However, there exists a secondary military arm that is infinitely more hazardous than the hired mercenary. Auxiliaries are foreign troops dispatched by a neighboring power to assist and defend your state in a moment of desperate need. But for the desperate prince who calls them in, they represent a ready-made ruin that is practically impossible to survive. If these foreign troops are decisively beaten, your state is completely undone and laid entirely bare to the advancing enemy. But if they are victorious, you instantly become the helpless captive of the very forces you blindly invited into your domain. Mercenaries require time and opportunity to organize a betrayal, because they are merely a loose collection of disparate men united by coin. Auxiliaries, however, arrive fully united, perfectly disciplined, and fiercely obedient to a foreign master. In mercenaries, the greatest danger lies in their innate cowardice. But in auxiliaries, the fatal threat is their aggressive valor. The clinically wise prince will therefore absolutely refuse to employ these foreign forces, choosing instead to rely on native subjects. A triumph achieved through borrowed military strength is merely an illusion that masks a deeper, permanent structural subjugation. When Cesare Borgia found his French auxiliaries and mercenary captains too dangerous, he ruthlessly destroyed them and armed his own men. His public reputation soared to unprecedented heights. Only when the world saw that he was the absolute master of his own military destiny. The biblical David wisely rejected the heavy armor offered by King Saul, knowing that the weapons of another would only weigh him down. The devastating decline of the mighty Roman Empire began at the precise moment they started enlisting Goths to fill their military ranks. By outsourcing their defense, the Romans drained the vital, martial energy from their empire and transferred it to their conquerors. The inescapable conclusion of political science is that no principality can ever be secure unless it possesses its own dedicated forces. Without native valor to defend the state in times of bitter adversity, a ruler is entirely dependent upon the random, shifting winds of fortune. A prince must therefore master the bloody mechanics of his own arms. But more importantly, he must now master the calculated art of the mind. Chapter 13. The Centaur's Secret. The mastery of arms provides the physical architecture of power, but the ultimate survival of the state depends entirely upon a much darker psychological revelation. We must now dissect the core Machiavellian epiphany, stripping away the comforting moralistic illusions that have dangerously blinded rulers for centuries. It is universally admitted that it is highly praiseworthy for a prince to keep his faith, to live with absolute integrity, and to reject all calculated deception. Yet the cold, unforgiving autopsy of history demonstrates a terrifyingly different reality regarding those who have actually maintained their iron grip on the throne. They have known precisely how to circumvent the intellect of men through craft, ultimately crushing those who naively relied upon their sacred binding pledges. To understand this grim paradox, a prince must recognize that there are two fundamentally distinct methods of contesting for supremacy in the bloody arena of states. The first method is the application of the law, which is the proper, civilized instrument of mankind. The second method is the application of raw, unmitigated force, which is the natural, unapologetic instrument of the beasts. Because the first method of legal persuasion is frequently insufficient to manage the inherent wickedness of men, a ruler is continually forced to employ the second. Therefore, it is absolutely essential for a sovereign prince to understand exactly how to avail himself of both the beast and the man. The ancients wrote that Achilles and many other legendary rulers were deliberately given to the mythological Centaur Chiron to be educated in his strict discipline. This mythological education symbolizes the absolute necessity for a ruler to intimately know how to utilize both the civilized and the feral aspects of his own complex nature. A sovereign who relies exclusively on his human virtues will be crushed by the violent realities of the world. For one nature without the other is simply not durable. The lion is a creature of magnificent, terrifying power, but it is tragically blind and cannot defend itself against the hidden snares set by hunters. The fox is a creature of supreme cunning, perfectly capable of detecting traps, yet it lacks the brute strength to defend itself against a pack of wolves. Therefore, the wise prince must be a fox to discover the invisible snares of his enemies, and a lion to terrify the aggressive wolves that circle his throne. Those naive rulers who choose to rely simply and exclusively upon the roaring power of the lion do not truly understand the lethal mechanics of survival. A prudent lord cannot, nor ought he to, keep his pledged faith when such strict observance of his word would eventually be turned as a weapon against him. But because men are fundamentally bad, profoundly selfish, and will gladly break their faith with you, you are not bound to blindly observe your faith with them. A truly calculating ruler must become a great pretender and a flawless dissembler, hiding his ruthless intentions behind a perfectly constructed mask of honorable predictability. Pope Alexander VI spent his entire brilliant career doing absolutely nothing else but deceiving the men around him to achieve his immense territorial gains. There never was a man who possessed a greater power of persuasive assertion, or who would affirm a promise with more sacred oaths, while intending to observe it less. Nevertheless, his monumental deceits always succeeded precisely according to his secret wishes, because he profoundly understood this gullible aspect of mankind. Therefore, it is not strictly necessary for a prince to actually possess all the noble qualities that are generally esteemed by the public, but it is absolutely, urgently necessary that he appears to possess them in the greatest possible abundance. To actually be unconditionally merciful, universally faithful, consistently humane, and genuinely upright is to invite total ruin among so many who are wicked. In order to maintain his state against the relentless tide of fortune, the sovereign is frequently forced to act entirely contrary to fidelity, friendship, and religion. He must not needlessly diverge from the path of the good if he can safely avoid doing so, but he must possess the absolute capability to plunge into evil when compelled by necessity. There is no specific quality more vitally necessary to fake than the appearance of deep religious piety. For religion is the ultimate anesthetic of the masses. Men in general judge far more by their eyes than by their hands, being easily captivated by the glittering surface of power, while ignorant of its hidden mechanics. Everyone sees what you meticulously appear to be, but very few are permitted to come close enough to touch the cold, calculating reality of what you truly are. The isolated critics are completely paralyzed by the sheer majesty of the state, which stands as a monolithic shield defending the prince's carefully constructed reputation. In all the actions of men, and most especially in the actions of sovereign princes, where there is no higher court of appeal, the world judges exclusively by the final result. Let a prince therefore violently conquer and ruthlessly hold his state by whatever brutal or deceptive means are required by the shifting winds of fortune. The bloody methods he employs will always be retroactively justified by the populace, and his actions will be universally praised as honorable and profoundly necessary. The vulgar masses are always taken in by spectacular appearances and the undeniable, concrete reality of absolute success. And in this grand, unforgiving geometry of power, the entire world is composed of nothing but the vulgar masses. The true architect of power recognizes that a man who insists on being uniformly good in a world of predators will only succeed in orchestrating his own magnificent destruction. With this dark, liberating secret firmly in hand, the prince must now navigate the treacherous public perception of his own artificial virtue. Chapter 14. The Prince's Mirror. Armed with this liberating secret, the sovereign must now meticulously manage the theatre of his own reputation. He stands constantly upon a brightly illuminated stage, entirely exposed to the unblinking gaze of the masses. This uncompromising architectural blueprint of power brings the clinical strategist to the most eternal and profound question of human governance. Is it better for a prince to be deeply loved by his people, or is it better to be universally feared? The sentimental idealist will automatically argue that a ruler should rightfully desire to possess both affections simultaneously. But the unforgiving mathematics of human nature dictate that it is practically impossible to unite these two opposing forces in one man. When a choice is forced upon the ruler, the clinical truth emerges with brutal, unapologetic clarity. It is infinitely safer to be feared than to be loved. To understand this grim reality, one must strip away all comfortable illusions regarding the fundamental nature of men. Human beings are universally ungrateful, dangerously fickle, cowardly in the face of danger, and violently covetous of gain. As long as you are dispensing benefits, they will eagerly offer you their blood, their property, and their lives when the actual need is far distant. But the moment the dark clouds of adversity gather and genuine danger approaches, they will instantly turn their backs on you. The mechanics of love are desperately fragile because they rely entirely on the human concept of obligation. Because men are fundamentally base creatures, they will ruthlessly sever the bond of love whenever it serves their own selfish advantage. Fear, however, is preserved by the absolute, paralyzing dread of physical punishment. Yet, the master architect of power must walk a razor-thin line in his application of this heavy chain of terror. He must inspire fear in such a carefully calibrated manner that he successfully avoids being hated. It is perfectly possible and highly effective for a ruler to be intensely feared without crossing the fatal threshold into active hatred. The formula for maintaining this vital balance is simple, austere, and mathematically absolute. The prince must keep his hands completely off the property of his citizens and strictly avoid the women of his subjects. When the state requires the execution of a subject, the ruler must only proceed when there is a manifest cause and an undeniable justification. But above all other temptations, he must fiercely resist the urge to confiscate the ancestral wealth of the condemned. In the cold ledger of the human heart, men will consistently forgive the murder of their father far quicker than they will forget the loss of their inheritance. While managing cruelty at home is delicate, a ruler in the field with a multitude of soldiers must entirely disregard his reputation for cruelty. Without a terrifying reputation for absolute severity, he will never keep his army united or disposed to its bloody duties. We look to the towering historical archetype of Hannibal Barca to observe the perfect clinical application of military terror. Hannibal led a massive, sprawling army composed of countless diverse races into the hostile territory of foreign lands. Yet, in both his spectacular victories and his agonizing defeats, not a single whisper of dissension ever arose among his men. This astonishing unity was not the result of his brilliant tactical maneuvers, but arose entirely from his legendary, inhuman cruelty. This boundless ferocity must be directly contrasted with the tragic, structural failure of Scipio Africanus. Despite Scipio's supreme excellence, his entire army violently rebelled in Spain due to nothing else but his excessive, debilitating leniency. He granted his soldiers far more freedom and license than the rigid architecture of military discipline can possibly sustain. For this dangerous weakness, he was brutally upbraided in the Roman Senate and labeled the corrupter of the Roman military machine. The management of military force requires an unyielding mind, but a prince cannot execute his vision entirely alone. He must construct an inner circle of intelligence, making the art of the secretary one of the most vital components of his reign. The very first conjecture regarding the actual capability of a ruler is always drawn by observing the men he has gathered around him. When a prince's ministers are demonstrably capable and unwaveringly faithful, the world instantly judges the sovereign to be wise. To build a functional court, the prince must aggressively defend himself against the deadly, intoxicating poison of flatterers. Every royal court is choked with sycophants who are utterly absorbed in their own survival and advancement. If you proclaim that any man may speak the unvarnished truth to you, the inherent reverence for your absolute authority will instantly vanish. Therefore, the prudent sovereign must actively select a small, exclusive group of wise men and grant them alone the liberty to speak the absolute truth. Crucially, they must only be permitted to speak this truth concerning the specific matters he explicitly asks about, and nothing else. He must relentlessly question these chosen advisors, listen to their answers, and then forge his final, irrevocable decision in solitary silence. Outside of this tightly regulated inner circle, the prince must aggressively refuse to listen to anyone else. The ruler who acts otherwise is either rapidly overthrown by flatterers or constantly shifting his policies under the weight of conflicting advice. With his fearsome reputation solidified and his trusted counsel firmly in place, the prince has insulated his throne with the sharp minds of capable men. But even the most perfect prince is subject to the wild, rushing river of the world. Chapter 15. The Dying Echo. Even the most perfect prince is subject to the wild, rushing river of the world. Men frequently surrender to the fatalistic illusion that human prudence cannot alter the course of events. They yield entirely to the paralyzing belief that they possess no remedy against destiny. Yet, to dismiss the vital agency of human free will is a catastrophic intellectual surrender. The clinical realist must recognize that fortune is merely the arbiter of one half of our earthly actions. She deliberately leaves the remaining half to be aggressively governed by raw human valor. We must accurately visualize this unpredictable force of fortuna as a violent, raging river. When this torrential river becomes enraged, it catastrophically floods the plains and tears down ancient trees. It rips away massive structural foundations and washes solid earth from one side to deposit it on the other. But the destructive inevitability of this water does not mathematically mean men are completely helpless. A calculating ruler must proactively construct unyielding barriers and fortified defenses before seasonal storms arrive. When the dark floodwaters swell and rage once more, these engineered canals will safely constrain the deadly surge. Fortuna operates precisely in this destructive manner, demonstrating chaotic power strictly where no virtue resists her. She fiercely directs her attacks toward those specific points where banks and barriers have not been proactively erected. If we strictly examine the fractured political landscape of Italy, we see a sprawling plain completely devoid of defensive barriers. The Italian peninsula has tragically allowed itself to be relentlessly battered by the shifting winds of foreign ambition. This systemic vulnerability was violently mirrored in the sudden collapse of Niccolò Machiavelli's own political career. In the fateful year of 1512, the machinery of the free Florentine Republic was abruptly shattered by the returning Medici. Machiavelli was summarily dismissed from his powerful office and stripped of his influential diplomatic rank. He was violently thrown into a dark cell, heavily shackled in irons, and subjected to the excruciating agony of the strappado. Yet, the fiercely analytical mind that had so coldly dissected the failures of kings refused to permanently break under physical torture. He emerged from the bloody dungeons of the Medici as a physically broken, profoundly impoverished exile. He was banished entirely to his dusty rural property at San Casciano to live in deeply humiliating isolation. But when the evening shadows lengthened across the Tuscan hills, he executed a profound daily ritual of intellectual transcendence. He methodically stripped off his mud-stained peasant garments and meticulously donned his pristine, noble court dress. Clothed once more in the dignified vestments of a statesman, he stepped confidently into the silent courts of the great men of old. He engaged in a continuous forensic dialogue with legendary conquerors, demanding the specific reasons for their historical actions. It was exclusively within this isolated literary sanctuary that he masterfully forged his uncompromising blueprint of absolute sovereign power. But this cold, unsentimental autopsy of ultimate sovereignty concluded with a fiercely burning plea for immediate national salvation. The final monumental chapter of his manual is a passionate exhortation, specifically directed to the illustrious house of the Medici. He vividly described an Italy more deeply enslaved than the ancient Hebrews, and more tragically scattered than the divided Athenians. The fractured country was completely without a definitive head, severely beaten, violently despoiled, fiercely torn, and utterly overrun. She was waiting desperately to finally see who would step forward as the designated liberator to permanently heal her festering historical sores. Machiavelli aggressively demanded a highly decisive prince, capable of deploying absolute force to forcefully drive the arrogant barbarians out of the homeland. He profoundly understood that such a monumental military enterprise strictly required a massive native army, fiercely disciplined and bound irrevocably to the singular iron will of one sovereign architect. This passionate, structurally sound vision of a heavily militarized, unified Italy went tragically ignored by the very men to whom it was dedicated. Machiavelli ultimately died in the year 1527, politically marginalized and profoundly impoverished, having never once seen his profound theories actively applied. His highly subversive manuscript was soon placed on the strict papal index of prohibited books, officially condemned as the absolute work of the devil. His very family name was permanently mutated into a universal, lasting slur for base deceit, calculated treachery, and unvarnished political evil. Yet, deeply nestled within the cold stone walls of the majestic Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence, ultimately stands a towering, monumental cenotaph. The stark Latin inscription, deeply carved into the white marble, reads simply that absolutely no elegy could ever be equal to such a magnificent name. The vigilant Florentine Secretary was never merely a cynical observer of violence, but rather the uncompromising intellectual father of our modern political reality. He was the absolutely first architect genuinely brave enough to permanently strip away the comforting cloaks of organized religion and philosophical idealism. He fearlessly exposed the mechanical gears of human ambition, clearly demonstrating exactly how the heavy levers of absolute sovereignty are operated. The ancient imaginary republics of the past have completely crumbled to historical dust, but the ruthless, cyclical nature of mankind remains forever unchanged. As long as ambitious men fiercely desire absolute power, they will forever be forced to rigorously study the grim, bloody instructions permanently left behind by the supreme architect of the state,